Okay. So my claim about a day for a year principle, I don't hold this view just because I was taught it. I've studied what the preterists and the literalists and the futurists, etc., say. I see their mismatching of concepts from because they're not part of a denomination, so they are right, I guess. And I see them grabbing ideas from different historically theological positions, and I see it being inconsistent and not viable. So this is not my ignorance; it's my informed decision to see the consistency of the Adventist view, in my opinion. Okay, so just keep that in mind. I've talked to the people who hold the views and the reasons they argue for, and I see why they're wrong, in my opinion. So, but let me give you a little. The year day principle for interpretation is not an Adventist idea. I've shown how it's actually the historic majority view of those who did comment on, admittedly, one of the more difficult interpretive issues in the Bible. So, from time to time, questions arise concerning the Adventist position regarding a day for a year principle in the interpretation of the prophetic periods in symbolic prophecy. Everyone acknowledges this is an interpretive method, okay, in regards to understanding the meaning of symbolic prophecy, right? We don't think there's really a dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, right? Because it's symbolic of something. And the scripture shows us what it's symbolic of from Daniel. That's why, it's symbolic. It's just to not recognize that is to be ignorant. It's not a denominational position, that view. It's just sensible understanding of the types of literature there are and how the Bible is using symbolism. We're reminded that the two passages that are often pointed to deal with matters somewhat different from the prophetic periods, such as the 1260, the 1290, and the 2300-day prophecies. Two classical texts that are mentioned are Numbers 14:34. It says, "According to the number of days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear your iniquity 40 years." Or Ezekiel is a similar, Ezekiel 4:6, you can look up. Basically, he says a day for a year according to what happens, right? And of course, the 70 weeks or sevens are based off the weekly cycle, and because the added Sabbaths are annual Sabbaths added from the weekly principle of a week and with a Sabbath instituted at creation. So even if you don't interpret Daniel 9 as being weeks, and you say, well, it means heptads, which doesn't really make sense because the word there is the same word translated as weeks elsewhere. But if you want to argue it's not saying weeks, well, the idea of what it's based on is a day for a year, even if that's the case, even if you want to translate it as not as weeks, which really doesn't make a lot of consistent sense. But that's fine. Okay, it's heptads then. Okay. Well, the heptads are annual Sabbaths that were based off the pattern of weekly Sabbaths. The original Sabbath pattern is used as a template for the annual Sabbaths. People don't even know that that's a thing. There's a yearly, or every 7 years, the Jubilee cycle is based off the weekly cycle, which is established at the beginning of creation. So it really doesn't do you any good to try to distance yourself from translating it as weeks, because the whole concept of added Sabbaths is based off of the original Sabbath instituted pre-fall. So it really, either way, it's like you're desperate to get away from the implications, but they're still there either way, however you want to translate the word Sabbata in Daniel 9. It is true that the context and application give some point to the question, but before we permit this to influence us too strongly, would it not be well to investigate the matter? And especially the text just mentioned, Numbers 14 and Ezekiel. Then we shall be able to reach a more reasonable and accurate conclusion. Before doing that, however, we must bear in mind that Adventists are not the originators of this principle. It existed in the Christian church and in Jewish circles before we existed. We Adventists. We're not alone in holding to this concept. Many Bible expositors, even today, advocate the year-day principle in their explanation of the prophetic time periods of Daniel and the Apocalypse. Let us look at the matter historically before we come to the biblical evidence. This will be referred to but briefly and for one purpose only, and that is to show that our adoption of this plan is not something that stems only from the great Second Advent Awakening of 1820, including the William Miller movement. It goes back beyond the medieval centuries and even before that. In fact, there were advocates in both Jewish and Christian circles in the early centuries of the AD period. Rabbi Dosa in the 4th century AD said, God's day of vengeance is a year, and is in the case of the spies on account of whom the Israelites were condemned to wander 40 years, a year for each day. Rabbi Johanan in the 2nd century AD remarked, it is written, after the number of the days in which you spied out the land, did they then sin 40 years? Was it not 40 days that they sinned? Hippolytus, Bishop of Porto, AD 160 to 235, wrote, I shall make a covenant of 1 week. By 1 week, he indicates 7 years. Going back even a century earlier, we read of Akiba ben Joseph in AD 50 to 132, referred to in a modern work by a Jewish author, that from the letters of our Akiba, we learn that the world will come to an end in 6093 AM. Abba Hillel Silver, in a paperback edition of his work published in 1959, lists several Jewish commentators who recognize the year-day principle as applied to the 1290, 1335, and 2300 days of Daniel's prophecies, or evening mornings. However, the principle was recognized much earlier than this, as we shall see in the next section on the biblical evidence. We are naturally more concerned with the biblical data on this matter, but it's helpful to know that it has been recognized for many centuries. In thinking of evidence from scriptures, we'll look first of all at our time-honored texts in Numbers and Ezekiel. Is there something in these passages that many have overlooked? Let us see. In these texts, we read the expression each day for a year. It is there just once in each text. If we look at the marginal reading of Ezekiel 4:6, in some of our KJV Bibles, we shall see it stated twice, a day for a year. A day for a year. Now, why is this? Is this merely a translator's note? Is it an alternative translation of the Hebrew text? Some of our English Bibles render it in this way in their actual text. The fact is that it appears in the double form in the Hebrew text and also in the Aramaic Targum text. So the marginal rendering, after all, is correct. Now, what is the significance of this repetition? Did it have a special meaning to the Hebrew mind? According to Hebrew authorities, this form indicates, among other things, the idea of definite emphasis. We see an instance of this in Isaiah 26:3. This is one of the comforting and assuring promises of God. It reads, "Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace." Notice the adjective, but this is not in the Hebrew text. There it reads peace, peace, but that doesn't convey to our minds what it did to the Hebrew reader. But the repetition did mean something to him. He might not use adjectives and adverbs as we would to express this. We would do so as in the word perfect. In other words, the Hebrew literal word for word translation is shalom, shalom. Double, it's stated twice. And so the King James says, "Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace." Perfect being in italics. To see, this is where word for word fails to transfer the meaning that the word for word translation would fail to do. But in honesty, they put perfect in italics. In other words, in their language, to say it twice is an emphasis. But if you just translated it, "It will keep him in peace, peace," people wouldn't understand that. But in our language, to say perfect peace and then demonstrate perfect wasn't in the original text, but it's added to convey the meaning. So this is why there's no such thing as a perfect translation, because how are you going to define perfect? Should he have said, "Thou wilt keep him in peace, peace"? Would your mind grasp that as an modern English reader? No, the King James did a good job in putting the word perfect in italics, because it's not a word perfect from the Hebrew, but it conveys what that means to the Hebrew mind for the English reader. See, that's a thoughtful, interpretive decision. But it's not a perfect word for word. A perfect word for word would have said peace, peace. But it wouldn't have conveyed the meaning to your mind as well. And not everybody's a scholar. So they make decisions to help you understand what it meant to the original audience, taking in mind our cultural context and our understanding of theirs. The repetition did mean something to him. He might not use with the Hebrew concept in mind, we could just as well read the text, "Thou wilt keep him in peace." Yes, inexpressible peace. Peace that is wonderful beyond all description. Might not this text from Isaiah have been in the apostle's mind when he wrote to the church at Philippi? The peace of God which surpasses all power of comprehension. Philippians 4:7. The same emphasis must be carried over to a day for a year, a day for a year. It is as though Moses and Ezekiel were saying, "A day for a year, yes, and never forget it." And this is what I mean. Does not this repetition enhance the importance of the twice repeated phrase in Ezekiel 4:6? It doesn't answer the query raised at the beginning of this article, but it does stress its vital significance, and especially so in the light of our historic interpretation. The main Hebrew word rendered as day in the Old Testament is the noun yom, or yamin, plural. In the Greek Septuagint and in the Greek New Testament, it is hemera, or hemerai, plural. These words have a wide range of meaning. In most places, the Hebrew word ydm, or yom, generally means day, and is so translated in the KJV Bible more than 1,200 times. Furthermore, quite generally, it means a 24-hour day, like in Genesis 1:5. Sometimes it means just the light part of a day, in verse 16, for instance, of Genesis 1. But one of the ways in which it's translated is by using the word year. Did you know that? One concordance lists no less than 23 instances of this. And notice the first use. "Thou shalt therefore keep those ordinance of the Passover in his season from year to year." Hebrew, mayimim, yamima. But the Hebrew word yamim is used twice in the plural form, which idiomatically means from year to year. Do you get that? A literal translation for the annual feast that they're to keep, like the Passover, and it's translated in the English year to year. The word year is the plural word for day, from days to days. And word for word translation of annual or year to year in the English is yamim yamim. So literally in the idiomatic usage of the Hebrew development of their language in the text, we see how days and years overlap each other, the concept. It's meant to say annual. We know that. And we know that historically, obviously. And from other texts, this is delineated or this is seen. But you wouldn't know that reading the English Bible. Year to year is plural days to plural days. Think about that. It's idiomatic in the very use of language that's missed in the English translation, which relates the year and the day idea in the Hebrew mind. It's very significant. The idiomatic meaning of year to year for the Passover was annual, yearly. In the Septuagint, a Greek translation, a later Greek translation of the Hebrew text, some several hundred years before Jesus, may help us think about this better, looking at the historical translations here. What applies to the Hebrew word ydm, or yom, or yomim, plural, applies also to the Greek word hemera, singular or plural. This is rendered year in the same text in the LXX. In other words, they didn't do a word for word translation. They did a meaningful translation of what it was meant, how we understand it. Here in the New Testament, there are just 3 instances of Hemera translated as year in the New Testament. Luke 1, 7 and 18. Elizabeth was well stricken in years. Hemeras. Luke 2:36. Anna was of a great age. In the Greek text, it is advanced in years. Hemeras. The word day can mean a long period of time. This is obvious even in our own language. But concerning their Hebrew word, note a day of wrath, Zephaniah 1:15, the day of trouble, Ezekiel 7:7, the day of vengeance in Isaiah 61, the day of affliction in Jeremiah 16, the day of judgment in Matthew 10, a day of salvation, Isaiah 49. That isn't meant to say a single day. It's a time period. It's a period of time. The day of the Lord could be understood this way too, perhaps. The words day and year are equated in places. The words day, yom, and year, shana, are in several instances equated. Note the following: the day of the Lord in Ezekiel 30, verse 3. The year of the Lord, Isaiah 61, 2. The day of visitation and the year of visitation. The year of recompense in Isaiah 34. The days of recompense in Hosea 9, 7. In each instance, day in Hebrew is yom and year is shana, but they're talking of the same period. In the Greek Septuagint, the word day is hemera and the year is eniotos. This equation can be seen also in one verse as in the following: David had been with me these days, yamim, or these years, shanim, 1 Samuel 29:3. And the time literally, days, yamim, that Jehu reigned over Israel were 20 and 8 years, shanim. In this review, we've seen that the word day, yom, was used in a variety of circumstances and applied to many different aspects of human affairs and relationships. So ought there to be any real difficulty in understanding that the same principle of recognizing that a day represents a year could be applied to prophetic periods? One other thing that might be queried is whether Daniel understood the 2300 days or evening mornings of Daniel 8:14 to be less just 24-hour days, or whether they meant years to him. We must remember that he would be acquainted with the day for a year concept in Numbers 14:34. We should bear in mind also that he was a contemporary of Ezekiel. Furthermore, we must remember that Daniel's mind was on the 70 years of captivity and on the time when that period was going to end. When he heard the answer of the Holy One in heaven to question how long, the idea that 2300 days would be literal days would have meant nothing to him. Just 6 1/3 years at most. But if he understood the 2300 days to be years, then we can appreciate, to some extent at least, why he fainted at the idea of a period of 2300 years when he had been thinking of just 70. This certainly would not have been enough to cause him to be not only astonished in verse 27, Daniel 8, but confounded, appalled, or dazed, according to different scholars' translation from Daniel 8:27. Observe also the significant comment from Ellen White on this revelation. Though another vision, further light was thrown upon the events of the future, and it was at the close of this vision that Daniel heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spoke, how long shall be the vision? Daniel 8:13. The answer that was given, unto 2300 days, then, or evening mornings, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed, filled him with perplexity. Earnestly he sought for the meaning of the vision. He could not understand the relations sustained by the 70 years captivity, as foretold through Jeremiah, to the 2300 years that in vision he had heard the heavenly visitation or visitant declare should elapse before the cleansing of God's sanctuary. Let us bear in mind also that the same principle was endorsed by Ellen White in the interpretation and application of Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6, that a day in prophecy stands for a year.